Hello there. Nice to see you again. We're going to move on and carry on with CC5A, the PowerPoint, the narrative PowerPoint on. Just finished in the last one, if you remember, short run, perfectly competitive companies that are attempted to profit maximize and the various options that they might end up in. And what we're going to do now is move on and start to look at something slightly different, same sort of principle, but in this case, we're looking at long run profit maximizing equilibrium. Again, still within perfect competition. Okay, so this is on page 22 of your yellow booklet, course companion 5A, and this is specifically talking about what happens in the long run if in a perfectly competitive market, a business is achieving supernormal profits. And basically what will happen is that those supernormal profits will basically get competed away. Now, to some degree, as we go through this process, hopefully try and bear in mind some of these conditions that we talked about, which actually need to be in place for a market to be perfectly competitive. Things like low barriers to entry, and the fact that all businesses are producing the same good, at the same price, etc., etc. And some of that will, if you can remember that and bear that in mind, hopefully some of this will start to make a bit more sense for you. Okay, so page 22, as I mentioned in your booklet, we're going to look at long run profit maximization in a perfectly competitive market and what might happen to the equilibrium points. So obviously if a business is making supernormal profits, then chances are that firms will, because it's easy to enter into a perfectly competitive market, will see the amount of profits being made because they've got perfect knowledge of the market, and they will be attracted by those profits. And fundamentally, that would mean that more people will come in and start to supply the market. And essentially, the supernormal profits over time will get competed away in the long run. So let's just take a look at how we might demonstrate that and show that graphically. Again, we're going to give this principle of showing what the industry position would be and also how it would affect a firm. So we've got our axes ready to draw in our graphs, and then obviously we can talk through the process. So first things first, let's draw in our axes and label our axes in the same way as normal. So for the industry, it's price against quantity. For the individual firm, it's cost and revenue against quantity. And that's basically what we're going to be looking at. So let's take a look at the industry position first then. Okay, so we've got our demand curve, our downward sloping demand curve. We've got our upward sloping supply curve, and that's S1. We've labeled that as S1. So that's the supply curve in the first instance. Okay, let's take a look at the next point that we're going to add in then. Basically, we're going to draw in our equilibrium price, which effectively is going to be where supply meets demand, and that clearly is also, because it's a perfectly competitive market, that is going to be a horizontal line. That price is not going to vary at that particular equilibrium point. Okay, so let's take a look at what happens when we have a scenario where we get more businesses coming into the market. Okay, so basically, let's just draw in the elements of the firm before we have any changes going on in the marketplace. So we've got our marginal revenue, our average revenue and demand curve, and also our marginal cost curve drawn in for the firm. Let's take a look at what happens now then. So we've got our average cost curve in there too, okay, demonstrating that at that point our average cost is significantly below our marginal revenue, and as a result of that, we are, in this scenario, in the first instance, going to be showing that we're making a profit. Okay, so in this case, you can see where our average cost crosses the marginal cost, the quantity that we're producing at profit maximization. You can see that there is a significant difference between our average cost and our marginal revenue, represented by the dotted box line like so. So you can see in that scenario, before we have any changes going on in the marketplace, okay, that is created. We've created our, let's go back one. We've created a supernormal profit position. So that green box is demonstrating that at profit maximizing, where MC equals MR quantity production, we can see that at the point at which average cost is crossing our quantity equilibrium point, if you like, that there is a significant difference between that point and where MC equals MR. So that's our supernormal profit box represented by the green box, okay? Let's take a look then at the next stage if we have further changes in the marketplace, okay? So in essence, if we get a scenario where marginal revenue falls, in order to, well, the point at which we might find that this extra competition is a little bit difficult to see that. You can see that effectively, because we've got extra competition coming into the marketplace, that is going to cause and profits eventually will be competed away to the point at which where we are making normal profits. Remember, that is the point at which marginal revenue and average revenue are the same, and the demand curve is horizontal. But also remember, that's where average cost and average revenue are at the same point. Okay, that's the point at which we would be performing if we were achieving normal profits as opposed to supernormal profits. So we can see in this situation, should that happen, we would also have a different price in the industry, because effectively the new people coming into the marketplace to compete away those profits means that there is going to be a fall in market share for the individual firm, and also there is going to be a fall in price as there is more supply. Effectively, that's caused by this entry of firms into the market. Okay, so effectively we've moved from our original equilibrium point at S1 to S2, and you can see that demand, the demand curve has stayed the same, but basically our supply curve has increased significantly, and as a result of that, we arrive at this different price at P2. Okay, and that's basically been caused by effectively businesses spotting that there's an industry where there's profits to be made, and the new competition has come in. Market share has fallen for the individual firm that was originally making the supernormal profits, and that has also driven the price, the selling price of the item, downwards too. Okay, so hopefully that makes some sense. You can see that effectively our level of quantity and our new equilibrium point for the industry is at Q2, and with the price being P2. And you can see in our scenario for the individual firm, our new quantity that we're going to produce out will be Q2. That's the point at which average cost and average revenue are equal. And that clearly has caused that significant change. I'm just going to go back and let you take a look at that. Obviously, you can stop this at any stage and draw in each individual line as we go. But hopefully that makes some sense. Okay, so effectively, new firms spotting supernormal profits enter the market. That essentially increases the level of supply. That drives down the overall selling price, and effectively what that will do is compete away any supernormal profits that any business is making in a perfectly competitive market in the long run, simply because, as we've said, because of some of the conditions that have to exist for perfectly competitive markets to work, then that scenario would occur. Okay, effectively we'd move from a supernormal profit position where, if you remember, if I just show you where with the cursor, the difference between average cost and average revenue is significantly a significant amount, and that created supernormal profits. But then effectively those supernormal profits were competed away, and we ended up at normal profits, the point at which average revenue equals average cost. Okay, So that's the first scenario. So that's showing you the first element on the top of page 22. Okay, now if we take a look at the second point then, so we've looked at number one. The second point, if we have a situation where firms are making subnormal profits or losses in the short run, then businesses are likely to leave the industry, as by definition they are not covering their operating costs. Okay, and in that scenario, that would cause a reduction in supply, in industry supply. This is all in your notes on page 22, and that would cause the supply curve to shift to the left, and that would increase the price for the remaining firms, such as subnormal profits or losses would be eliminated. Now, that's all well and good me describing that. Let's take a look at what it looks like in graphical format then. Okay, so that again is on halfway down page 22 in your booklets, and hopefully what you should be able to do is follow this step by step. So let's take a look at it. We're in the scenario where in our perfectly competitive market, we've got subnormal profits or losses, essentially. So a subnormal profit is essentially a loss, isn't it? And again, that would be eliminated in the long run in the same way, or not in the same way, in a similar way to which supernormal profits would be also work. They'd be competed away in this scenario for a number of reasons, as we've just described. We would find that businesses would actually be thinking about moving out of that business or out of that industry because they can't sustain losses for a long period of time. Let's take a look at what this is going to look like then. So again, we'll draw in our graphs with our axes, label them all up. And in this scenario, we've got the same industry supply and demand curve and our equilibrium point. We've got P1 at our equilibrium price and Q1 at our equilibrium quantity. Obviously, again, perfectly competitive market, the price is going to be a horizontal line, okay, as we've described before. Let's take a look at what happens in the scenario where we've got our firm's demand and supply curves. So we've got our marginal revenue equaling average revenue and also the demand curve. We've got our marginal cost line in, so that's the point at which, given that we are a profit maximizer in a perfectly competitive market, we would produce at Q1, okay, and that would be at price 1. Now, in this scenario, where we've got a position where our average cost is significantly higher than our average revenue, clearly in that position, we are not in a very good spot, because as you can see, the quantity that we would need to be producing at in order to break even, and not make normal profits, just to break even to get to our average cost line, is significantly higher than our average revenue line, as denoted by the dotted red line, as we can see just here. Okay, so effectively our average cost curve is higher than our average revenue curve, and that's obviously causing us a bit of an issue. Now, clearly we can see in this situation, when we draw across like so, we can see that in order for us to perform at this level and actually to make normal profits, we would actually be needing to charge at a significantly higher price, as we can see when we label that in. So there is essentially subnormal profit. Okay, the point at which, if we're producing at the point at which we are attempting to profit maximize, but our average costs are significantly higher than our average revenue, we've got a bit of an issue. Okay, so that basically, let's just go back. That red box there is essentially showing the level of subnormal profit. Okay, so let's then take a look at the next stage and the next thing that would happen then, okay, in that situation. Effectively, what would happen is that in this situation, if we were to do that, if we were to change this scenario, then the market share would increase. We've talked about the change basically being that the individual firms that are making subnormal profits would basically choose to move out of the marketplace. Okay, now one could argue that in that situation, that's going to change the level of supply, and that's going to cause an increase in the price for remaining firms, such that eventually the subnormal profits would actually be eliminated. And you can see in this situation where if we were able to do that at that point, that's going to then mean that our price that we're charging is going to be slightly higher. It's going to be at P2. Effectively, that's where we're going to get to the point where we're actually making normal profits, i.e. we're breaking even, and that's the point at which our average revenue line and our average cost line is actually equal. Okay, so effectively what the market, because of it being perfectly competitive, is almost managing itself in a sense, in that the things that are either attracting industries or attracting firms into industries, i.e. supernormal profits, will eventually be competed away. But if we're in a situation where we have subnormal profits, then in time businesses will actually move out of those markets because they can't sustain their position, and because of that, effectively, that's going to change the amount amount of goods supplied, and that is essentially also going to drive the price upwards. Now that's shown by the change or the shift in supply to S2. So where firms leave the market, effectively, originally we were at our equilibrium point of S1, and where that crossed the demand curve, that was our original equilibrium. But as firms can't sustain and can't stay in the market because they're not making enough money, then firms choose to leave, and there we can see that's where that line then comes in. Okay, now again, that scenario is the way in which you would go about explaining that if there were subnormal profits, what would happen over time. They would basically be eliminated away by in the long run, based on the fact that firms would choose to leave the industry. Okay, so let's take a look at the next section then. Now, obviously, some of this might need a little bit of explanation when we come together and meet up face to face again, but we can go over some of these and we can explain them again should you need to. But hopefully, by stopping each of these presentations and just making sure that you're drawing in the correct graphs and being able to then explain what some of the reasons for this, then hopefully that will start to make a bit more sense. Okay. Okie dokie. So we can see there then that the different quantities. So quantity 2 at this new equilibrium point is now at price 2 in the industry, and you can see that our quantity 2 in this instance is going to be at this new price level P2. And that is essentially going to be the point at which our subnormal profits would be eliminated in the long run as firms choose to leave the industry. We would then gain market share, and as a result of that, that would mean that we would get to the point where we were making normal profits rather than subnormal profits. Okay, let's take a look at the next point then. Okay, we talked about the fact that we've got this issue where if we're not making sufficient profit, there will be a point at which a business will choose to, in the short run, would choose to shut down, or could choose to shut down. Now, this is actually explained on page 23 in your booklets, and it's quite a nice explanation on the right of the diagram that you will be drawing in shortly, and that hopefully is going to be relatively, that sort of explains the process for you. So I'm going to leave you to take a look at that in the first instance. Okay, try and just read through that and highlight the relevant bits that are included in there. So effectively what we're saying that in the short run, only variable costs must be covered in order for businesses to carry on. Now, there can be some very good reasons why they might choose to do that, but let's just take a look at what the scenario is here. Okay, now, effectively, you've got a narration for the diagram included on page 23 in the box next to your the first question or the first diagram. So let's just draw in the diagram and then explain how that works. And okay, so this is the point in the short run where businesses would choose to shut down. So in this case, because it's an individual firm, we've got cost and revenue against quantity, plotted against quantity. And in this situation, we've got a situation in the short run where our average revenue equals our price in the short run. Okay, and again, because it's a perfectly competitive market, we're looking at this in a perfectly competitive scenario. Our marginal revenue is going to equal our average revenue and is also equivalent to our demand curve. So we've now got our marginal cost curve coming in, which obviously then gives us a point at which we would normally be expected to be performing if we're a profit maximizer. Marginal cost, where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. But we've also, in this case, we've got our average total costs included, ATC, also sometimes known as the average cost, which is, again, significantly higher than our average revenue. And so at this point, we clearly would be at this, even if we were at profit maximization point, we are going to be making a loss or subnormal profits. So we can see that in this situation, okay, in order for us to actually make or meet our requirements at the point at which we are at profit maximization point, you can see that's the quantity that we would be producing at, which is quantity in the short run. Okay, well, you can see that at the moment that still would be a point at which we are actually making a loss, for want of a better term, or subnormal profits. So you can see that at this point, effectively, our marginal or our average revenue is below our average cost. Whoops, let's go back one. That's giving you too much information too quickly. Okay, so let's look at the next thing. Okay, so effectively, our average total cost in the short run, as you can see, based on what we've just described, is going to be higher than our average revenue. When we draw in the next point, if we take a look at our average variable cost, and remember the difference between average variable cost and average total cost is basically the average fixed cost not being included. Okay, now again, for a number of reasons, in some instances, provided your average variable costs are covered, and for every item of output that you're producing, you're actually at least covering your costs, then in some cases, some businesses might choose to simply carry on. Okay, so we can see in this scenario, within that position, our profit maximization position, you can see that our average variable cost is significantly lower than in the short run than our average revenue. Okay, so if we draw that in with another dotted line to show our AVC in the short run, okay, we can see that basically let's just take that out a minute. Whoops, a daisy, sorry. So that's the situation there where we've got our average variable cost in the short run below our average revenue. Now, if we draw in the next thing, the basic difference between those two things is essentially our average fixed costs in the short run, like I described before. So if we take our average total cost, take away our average variable cost, that essentially is going to leave us with the difference between those two figures would be the average fixed cost in the short run. Okay. Now we can see that we're in a scenario where and this is where I need you to take a look at your booklet, page 23, when we're actually showing these areas of a different cost. You can see that we've actually tried to make it slightly easier for you, so you can actually highlight. And this is something that you should try to get used to when you're drawing in these graphs. Show these different areas and then describe what those different areas show us. Okay, so effectively what we're saying here, if we follow the logic in terms of the explanation that's been given to you in page 23 of your booklet. Okay, if we then take a point and let's just read through it. As long as price or average revenue is equal to or greater than the average variable cost, then production will choose. Well, in some cases, organisations will choose to carry on with production. Okay, so the firm is only likely to shut down in the short run if we get to the point where our price or our average revenue is below our average variable cost. Okay, so that's the point at which we would actually consider stopping production, shutting down, getting to shutdown point. Okay, now clearly in that situation, that's the scenario we would be in. Okay, but if we take a look at look at the diagram and also look at the and it's a bit easier for you. Will be easier for you to do this when you've got the diagram drawn, and then you can actually use the explanation in the booklet to help you understand. So we're basically saying that if price is higher than average variable cost, and in this instance, clearly it is, our price in the short run is higher than our average variable cost. Okay, it is less than our average total cost, and we've explained that our average total cost is up here somewhere. But we are still making a contribution. The area B, C, G, F. Okay, toward our fixed costs. Okay, and that's the area A, C, E, G. Okay, so you can see in this case we are making a contribution, but in this scenario, because of that, because fixed costs are going to have to be paid anyway, the firm might choose to carry on in the short run and make a loss in inverted commas of that smaller area of A, B, FE. Okay, so it was still not going to cover our costs as such, our average total cost, but in this scenario, we would actually be willing to carry on and produce in certain instances. Clearly, one can't carry on as a business if you are constantly performing at a position where your average total cost or your average cost is significantly higher than your average revenue. But in the short run, in some instances, businesses may well carry on and do that. Okay, so that looks a bit confusing and a bit complicated, that graph. But again, if you just build it up step by step and stop at each stage in the presentation, like I've done. And what I'll do also is I'll make sure that these PowerPoints are on Teams so that you can obviously use the narrated PowerPoint to check it out, but also you can take a look at the PowerPoint without me narrating it as well, which might make it slightly easier when you come to drawing these diagrams. Okay, so let's take a look at the next point then. Okay, so we've talked about what we might do in the short run. Let's now take a look at what might happen. Oops. And again, this is just a little bit more guidance for you to help explain the process. Total fixed cost is basically our average fixed cost times by our quantity in the short run. Okay, so our total fixed cost in this scenario is basically the difference between our total average cost, okay, and also the average cost and our average variable cost. Effectively, what we're doing here is let's just go back a step a minute. Oops. So so that's the point at which we've established is where where our average total cost is significantly higher than average revenue, and also we've also demonstrated where the average variable cost line is being demonstrated. Okay, so effectively, contribution towards total fixed cost is basically our average revenue take away our average variable cost times by the quantity in the short run. Okay, so we can see that at that position we're actually making a significant contribution to our total fixed costs. However, we're still making a subnormal profit, or a better way of putting it is a loss, because essentially the point at which if we take our average revenue and take away our average total cost and then times that by the quantity that we're producing at, which is our profit maximisation point, at that point there, the green is demonstrating that we're making a subnormal profit, or as it's probably a better description of it, as actually a loss. So we can see that in that scenario then, to just take that slightly wider and then explain it in a bit more details, then our price in the short run, our minimum price in the short run, would have to be at this point here. So that's the point at which, effectively, if we're covering our average variable cost, then we may well carry on, and but any lower than that point, then clearly we are not going to do so. We are going to actually choose to shut down. Okay, so that's basically shut down, our short run shutdown point. Okay, so the minimum price necessary for the firm to continue to produce would need to be at PSR. That's where we're achieving our minimum average variable cost. Okay. So let's take a look at that in the long run then. Okay, so if we take a look at page 23, okay, so one could argue, remember, one of the issues that we need to remember is that in the long run, we've said that in economic terms that all costs are variable. Okay, so both in the long run, essentially, what that means is that we must be covering all costs, because if we don't do that in time, that's going to cause us a major problem. Okay, and effectively, let's just draw this in and demonstrate the point. So again, you've got a narrative on at the bottom of page 23, on the right hand side in the box. Okay, so if we're talking about the long run, we've got to make sure all costs, so that includes variable and fixed costs, must be covered. So effectively, the price that we're achieving must be equal to or higher than our average total cost. Okay. Now, clearly, any rational firm is not going to carry on if it's sustaining losses on a regular basis. Okay. Now, clearly, certain stakeholders like shareholders will say, no, this isn't good enough, not having that, and to some degree, that is going to cause a major problem for a business. So let's take a look at how this looks in a graphical sense then. So again, we've got cost and revenue against quantity. We've got our average revenue and equaling our price in the long run, and our average total cost in the long run too. So we're saying that that's the point at which we must be achieving in order for us to carry on in the long run. If we fall below that point, then it's likely that we are going to be in a situation where we will not carry on. It's not a sustainable scenario. Okay, so let's take a look in this case at our marginal cost, drawing our marginal cost curve, drawing our average total cost curve, and drawing our average variable cost curve. Okay, so at this point here, our quantity in the long run essentially must be, if we're basing it on our profit maximisation point, is at QLR. Okay, if we draw in our average variable cost at that point, okay, in the long run, we can see that our average variable cost is significantly below our our average revenue at quantity LR in the long run. And it is also at that point we are also managing to achieve average total cost at the point at which we're talking about PLR price, but in the long run. So the difference, like we said before, the difference between the two, between our average variable cost and our average total cost, is average fixed cost in the long run. And that's represented by HJKL. Okay, so the point at which we would choose to shut down in the long run would be at this point here. Okay, that's because effectively our average revenue is lower than our average total cost. Okay, so anywhere below the point at which our average revenue is lower than our average total cost, clearly we would then choose to shut down. We would not carry on in the long run, because we're saying that effectively all costs are variable at that stage, and effectively we would need to be shutting down the business, taking our resources and choosing to move into another area of production. So why would you maybe choose, as a loss-making firm, why would you choose to carry on, and why would you be able to produce and to continue production in the long run? There could be some reasons for doing that. I want you to have a little think about that, and jot a few things down, and then obviously we'll come back and discuss that in a minute. Okay, so why might loss-making firms be able to continue production in the short run? Why might they choose to do it? Okay, let's take a look at some of the reasons why. Okay, it may be that they're in a position where they've got sufficient retained profits to be able to run some of those down. There might be a reason why they might choose to do that. They might have sufficient funds to be able to carry on in the short run in order to maintain providing their customers with supplies, etc., of the products involved. Okay, they could possibly utilize an overdraft facility. Again, in the short run, they might feel there's a reason why, a good reason why they might want to continue to supply, even though in the short run they might be losing some money. They could possibly issue more shares in order to keep the business going. And they could also extend credit terms with their suppliers in order to carry on. Why might they wish to continue to produce? That's a slightly different scenario, isn't it? But let's think about some of the reasons why they might choose to. And we sort of touched on a couple of those previously, haven't we? Okay, let's take a look at some. Well, one might be that we're in the hope that price will rise enough and our efficiency might improve enough such that normal profits might be made if we can make some improvements. Either maybe the price is going to go up. That would be a good thing. If we were making just a relatively small loss, we were making subnormal profits. But also maybe we could improve our level of efficiency so that we can reduce our average total cost, and that might then mean that we could actually start to make normal profits as opposed to subnormal profits. Reasons for that? Well, it could be to maintain or increase our market share. Again, if we're able to keep producing and able to keep selling, then we could use that in our marketing in the future to say, well, we are a market leader and we are gaining market share. Clearly, again, in the long run, we can't sustain that, but we might choose to in order to either maintain our market position or to increase our market share, perhaps. It could also be about building up customer loyalty, and maybe over time, as we maybe introduce a new product or we enhance the existing product in some shape or form, maybe we might be able to charge a higher price in the future. It could actually, in the short run, we might choose to protect jobs. Okay, we want to maintain our capacity and can maintain our good workforce. We don't necessarily want to give them their marching orders as soon as there's a small downturn. So it might be a case of protecting jobs. Again, in the short run, it's not something that we can do in the long run, but in the short run, we might choose to do that. And in some cases, as we've said before, okay, it could be the lesser of two evils. Okay, if we look at the short run shutdown point from the previous example on page 23, one could argue that it's better to lose a smaller area, which essentially is A, B, F, E, than the larger area A, C, G, E. So again, provided we're making some contribution towards our fixed costs, we might choose to carry on. Provided we are performing at least at the point of our average variable cost, then there might be a reason for carrying that process on. Okay, so Hopefully that makes a little bit of sense to you. Again, it's something that you might need to just have a little think about. Maybe we need to go through it again, and if we do so, then that's really not a problem. But it's really important that we understand some of these principles, okay? Okay, let's take a look at page 24 then, moving on to look at the marginal cost or marginal cost curve when it's above the variable cost in the firm's short run supply curve. Okay, and this is about demonstrating the point at which we can try and derive a supply curve in a perfectly competitive market. Okay, now again, there is some narrative included here on page 24. Which actually explains what we're going to show in our diagram here. Okay, so again, we're making a couple of assumptions. One is that we're in profit maximization mode, okay, and the firm will choose to produce where MC equals MR. So let's take a look at what that looks like. So cost and revenue against output, and we've got our marginal cost curve, and we've got our average variable cost curve drawn in two. Okay. Now, in this situation, then, if we've got a scenario where our price and our marginal revenue is at P1, again, we're in a perfectly competitive market, as we described previously. We've got the quantity at which we would be producing in order to produce that profit maximization point where MC equals MR. So in this situation, in this scenario, we can see that our average variable cost is significantly higher than our average revenue curve, which suggests that we may have a bit of an issue, okay? So we can see that at this particular price at P1, where MC equals MR, the output is Q1, okay? If we then take a look at the next point at which we've got a different price, okay? So this now is at P2, at price P2, again, where MC equals MR and our output is at Q2. Let's just draw that one in, okay? We're in a scenario where we are actually covering our average variable costs. However, we're not in a position at the moment where we're making any profit. We're actually just not even breaking even. We're just covering our average variable cost. If we move up to the scenario where we would have a price of P3, okay, and that again is based at that same point where we've got our marginal cost and marginal revenue. So that would be at that new price, we would be producing at Q3, okay? And all of these prices, the MC curve, the marginal cost curve, indicates the amount the firm will supply, as basically our price is essentially the same as the marginal cost, okay, at that particular point. So if we're in a situation there, our marginal cost curve is essentially representing the short run supply curve, provided that price is higher or equal to average variable cost, okay? And in that situation, that would be the position where effectively, let's just run through what would happen at each of these stages. So if we took our first scenario then, okay, at P1, okay, the firm would choose to shut down in the short run because the price is lower than the average variable cost. Okay, our average variable cost is up here, our price is down here. Okay, let's take a look at the next scenario then. Okay, so if we take a look at the firm at the two different prices at P2 and P3, okay, the firm would continue to produce in the short run because, as we can see in this situation, at P2 and at P3, well, at P2 we're actually covering our average variable cost, and at P3 we're covering our average variable cost plus a bit more. So that is actually making some contribution towards our overall fixed costs. Okay, so as we said, in the short run, we might choose to continue to produce for the reason that we talked about previously. If we then take a look at these fluctuating market prices, okay, as we can see here, our marginal revenue, where we get to the point where our marginal revenue equals our marginal cost, so equals our average revenue, sorry, that that is obviously moving up and down. The marginal cost curve, where it's above the average variable cost curve, okay, so at this point here, anywhere on this point here, that's determining the profit maximisation quantity, and so effectively is also the short run supply curve. Okay, so that would be the short run supply curve, because to be honest, we wouldn't be willing to produce at any lower point than that. Okay, so hopefully that makes a reasonable amount of sense. Okay, so if you think about that in the print, what we're trying to say is that the firm, it follows that the firm's long run supply curve is going to be the marginal cost curve above the average total cost, and that's assuming that all costs are covered, both fixed and variable, in the long run. Okay, now remember, what we're talking about here is the short run. So this is the scenario where we would choose to supply, okay, where we're at least at the point where our average variable costs are covered. But actually, the higher that we can go in this scenario, the better the picture is, and that we might actually get to a point where we're covering our average total costs, and that then gets us to the point where we're making normal profits. Okay, so quite a lot of technical drawing and a technical explanation there, but hopefully I think the more that you look at these things and the more that you test yourselves, the better and more familiar it will become. It's all probably a bit strange to you at the moment, because there are some odd sort of principles that you need to remember in terms of markets being perfectly competitive, and normal profits and subnormal profits, and all of this stuff is slightly, I wouldn't say confusing exactly, hopefully it's been explained reasonably clearly, but if we need to, we can go back over this and make sure that you're absolutely 100% clear on it all. Okay, so let's take a look then at an evaluation of the model of perfect competition, and then I think we'll give it a rest, and then we'll start the next presentation looking at the multi-choice questions. I think I was going to do those together, but I think we'll look at those at over the course of the next presentation. Okay, so let's take a look, and let's look at both a critique and a defense of perfect competition. Okay, so some of the things to bear in mind. We talked about some of the assumptions and characteristics of a perfectly competitive market, and we've already talked about some of the issues around it, okay, and some of the criticisms of it. But I think also we've got to try, if we're being asked to critique perfect competition as a principle, then we need to be able to defend it too. Okay, so I shall put my own personal opinions aside, and we'll give a balanced argument so that we can come up with a judgment too. Okay, let's take a look then at the criticisms. Then it is considered to be very unrealistic, and there are some overly strict assumptions within it. Remember, there are 6 that we have to bear in mind for a market to be perfectly competitive. It doesn't really take into account the lack of consumer choice. Now, clearly, that's something that would have a fundamental effect on markets. There can sometimes be corner cutting as firms try to minimise costs. So if that were the case, then if we were in a perfectly competitive market, would that be encouraged? And obviously, if we're in a situation where we have a lack of supernormal profits in the long run, that means there's going to be no reinvestment in research and development, no new products, and there's no chance of any sort of dynamic efficiency. Now, that's something that we'll look at a later stage. Okay, so dynamic efficiency is where, if an organization is making supernormal profits, in an ideal world, rather than just keeping those profits for themselves, in order to keep that particular company or that particular business, who might be in a strong market position, may even be in a monopoly position, then there is a danger that they won't necessarily choose to reinvest in those markets or improve the products, and as a result of that dynamic efficiency that we would ideally look for in a business might be lacking if there's no supernormal profits available. Let's look at defending the principles of perfectly competitive markets then. Well, clearly, one could argue as consumers, you're going to get the best price because it's going to be the lowest. And also, you're going to be getting the maximum consumer surplus, okay? So that effectively would mean that's the position in a perfectly competitive market. Assuming all of the other things are equal, you're going to get a position where your consumer is going to be pretty happy because they've got low prices, they've got lots of choice, and that will mean that their overall consumer surplus, the amount that they would be willing to pay, and the amount that they're actually paying for that particular good or service, is giving them maximum utility. So that clearly would be a good thing. You could also argue that in this scenario as well, if we take this perfectly competitive position where we would be making the best use of our resources in the long run, we would be productively efficient. Okay, there would be no waste. So that's the point at which our average total cost would be at its lowest point. Okay, or our long run average cost would be at its lowest point. We would be making the most from the resources that we're applying, and there would be no waste as a result. So that basically, that covers the last section of the perfectly competitive diagrams that we need to consider. So with the first area we looked at was the profits in the short run and the three different scenarios that a business might have in the short run. And then this presentation has taken into account some of the long run issues around profit maximisation. Again, in a perfectly competitive market, we've also then looked at shutdown points and also deriving a supply curve and in perfectly competitive markets, and also looked at some of the reasons why we might choose to carry on, plus also looked at a bit of a critique of perfectly competitive markets too. Okay, so I'm going to stop there, and like I said, we'll come back and look at some of the multi-choice questions on page 25 onwards in the next presentation. So thanks for listening, and we'll catch up soon.